computer.
You got that?
Yep, looks good. Yep.
Sweet. Just pause it for now. And if for some reason like people like seem to not or have trouble with Zoom, I might switch to the Discord because I have, you know, it's easy to do also. Let's see though.
Okay, that should be fine. Yeah. I can hear now. Okay. Let's see. All right. Okay.
So we have our own mini seminar series. Everyone's doing their seminar series, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So, I'll have some of my other friends I think are interested in joining. They just need a little bit of cajoling and maybe to see other people present. So we'll have something. Nothing will be as polished as your job market paper, but you know, most of my friends are like second and third years because I'm a second and third year. So.
That's nice. That's cool. I mean, it's good to have anything. And like, I think that those people can benefit from seeing more finished work also, like what it looks like when you're kind of on the outside, like
Right.
on the exit.
Yeah, right.
But I would say, and this is like kind of a humble brag, that this paper is short, I don't know, maybe more along the road towards publication than most people's thesis when they finish.
Well, that's good. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. I mean, it looks cool. It's a cool idea. Obviously, you must have gone or talked to Tanzanian officials and even gone to Tanzania and held the. I assume this is this an RCT or is this used?
No, this is observational data. This is a household consumption survey
Okay.
data, and it doesn't require any strong identifying assumptions, which is kind of the benefit.
Interesting.
Which is, I am an applied micro policy guy, so I am all about that shit, but this is one of those ways that we can sidestep it. And there are a lot of other things we can do in economics besides for, you know, applied micro papers that have a source of exogenous variation that's affecting a treatment variable that affects an outcome variable. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Which is a good recipe. I'm not knocking that recipe.
No. Yeah, right. So this does something else?
Yeah.
Okay. You could explain it when you do the presentation. No need to.
I would call this maybe in the vein of kind of Deaton type analysis.
Okay, I
with combined consumption
really
and production both.
So I don't know, but you know.
Yeah, I'm basically gonna start like by explaining it for. I'm gonna try and explain for people that just don't have any real exposure to development economics and don't have any real exposure to agricultural economics, and I sort of am gonna try and make sure that it makes sense for them too.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Yeah. We'll see. Hopefully my friends will join. You never know, because you know some of them say yes, but always, you know, if 3 or 4 say yes, you know, it's always only 1 or 2. Some of them forget.
Yeah, it's fine. I don't mind. I don't know if you know, but I used to be an esports broadcaster. I'm professional about it. I can preach to one person audience of one if I need to. It's not a problem.
Yeah. Have you seen Community?
Yes.
Yeah, so you remember the episode with the comedian who's like super offensive and he has like one person. I forgot what it's called. Anyways, there's this one episode and he's like presenting to like one person, like he's doing his act to one person, like in a whole auditorium.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, sometimes it's just going to be like that. So.
Yeah. I mean, we can start at 1, and I guess when people join, they can just join in. Let me see if I can get rid of the beep sound.
Yeah. Also, yeah, I might wait another 5 minutes.
Oh, you want to wait 5? Okay, yeah,
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 just to
that's
see.
fine.
And also, I'm printing like the most recent
Oh
draft
yeah,
version of the
Thomas is
paper.
here. Okay, hey Thomas. Well, he's still connecting. So yeah, Thomas is my friend.
Nice. I hope we don't get Zoom bombed by by African hackers.
Yeah, right. Hey Thomas.
Hey, Cameron.
What did we just walk into?
Jeff runs the Discord where a lot of it's an econ Discord, so yeah.
It's the Econ Discord, please.
Yeah.
I think the other ones pale by comparison.
Are there other ones? I've never heard of another one.
Not really. There's like one for a YouTube channel, but it's quite a cesspool. Like one day I was there, they were calling for Serbian genocide. The moderators were letting that happen.
Oh jeez.
Yeah. They're like pretty Austrian inclined, so they like preach Austrian economics nonstop.
So this is not really like an academic. That one's not really like an academic one.
That's how I would call it. If you go and look in their econometrics channel, you're gonna laugh. Like it's like memes. It's not econometric discussion. But it's actually larger by user base than ours. It's a little sad.
It's what happens when you get trolls, right? Everyone joins the trolls. Thomas would know. He does memes.
I do.
I was thinking we should have a meme contest on the server, an econ meme contest, but I couldn't think of a good prize.
I never had like a large enough audience to put effort into trying to make econ memes, but maybe like 2 or 3 people I know would appreciate them.
Oh man, this channel, our meme economy channel, is like one of the most popular channels on the server. You get stuff literally every day. There's memes there.
Is that like the subreddit meme economy? Or
no, on our server.
Okay.
Just people posting memes. And I make my own memes sometimes and post them. I have like 2 that I would call hits.
I'm not very good at making them, but I appreciate them. So I can try to make them, but
Thomas is a good aggregator of memes. He posts. We have like a mutual like a group chat or something, and he posts a lot of memes. So that's where I get all my memes from, Thomas.
I call myself an intermediary because I scroll through Reddit. There's a bunch of junk. There's also a bunch of like racist shit, kind of like what you were talking about, and I kind of screen through it all and then post the good stuff.
Yep. I understand. All right, let's see. Hold on one second.
You can see Kevin's behind me. And just curious, how active of an audience are you aiming for? Do you want us to be like asking questions like a real seminar, like every few minutes, or
What's up?
how active do you want us to be in asking questions?
I would probably ask you to, like, unless there's something like glaring on a slide or so, maybe hold them until the end. This is the first time I'm presenting this.
Right,
or maybe I'll pause in certain moments and ask for questions.
Okay.
Yeah, can anyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I was wondering if it would want me to treat it like a job market seminar would be, where they might give you like the first 10 or 15 minutes, and then after that, they'd kind of like, I'll hit like the raise my hand button or whatever it is, and ask questions at that point or whatever it is.
Yeah, also, like, if you have rolling, like, if you want to put rolling questions into the chat, I will try and address them once I get a moment in the presentation.
Okay, I'll put questions in the chat then.
Yeah. I'm going to start in about 2 minutes. Seven, that's good. That's good.
I'm not finding my webcam. Oh, I bet I know what's happening. Well, you can't change your push to talk option in Zoom.
Yeah, I don't even know how to do that. I think Blue Jeans, you can press space. Is there a button for push to talk in Zoom?
Yeah, but yeah, there's like a push to talk, but that's like, oh, one second, let me. Oh, it's just like if you mute yourself and then you hit space. So you guys can hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, okay, got it now.
All right, everybody can see, right?
Yeah, I can see.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and start. Okay, guys, thanks for coming. Sorry, I don't have a webcam up. I'm presenting from my desktop. And today I'm gonna present my job market paper. This paper has been in the works for maybe a little over 6 months in its current form, and then probably like a year to a year and a half. Plus, this kind of evolved from a class that we had where a professor was talking about the principle of separation, which is the key concept for this paper that I'm going to talk about first in the beginning. So I'm going to talk about the theoretical underpinning, that background first, and then what I'd like to do is, if you guys have questions about that, then I would like to take those questions. Then I'll go into the empirical section, and then I can take rolling questions during the empirical part where I'm feeling more comfortable about that. All right. So the objective of this paper and the contribution of this paper is to advance our understanding of Tanzanian agricultural labor markets. Agricultural labor markets are a very important subject in developing countries. A large share of the population in developing countries is still employed in subsistence agriculture. This is true in a lot of Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. And the literature on analyzing labor markets in developing countries, there's a seminal work in this literature by Dwayne Benjamin, where he takes the neoclassical model and applies some principles from the neoclassical economic models of production and consumption to agricultural household models. Now, this is kind of a marriage of the literature of agricultural subsistence household models and labor economics models. And the analysis of subsistence agriculture in quantitative form actually dates back to the original agricultural economist named Alexander Chayanov, who was a Russian who wrote his treatise on analyzing subsistence agriculture at the turn of the 20th century. So the literature originally of analyzing quantitatively subsistence farms goes back to Chayanov. The main primary source of inspiration for this paper is Benjamin's analysis of labor markets in developing countries. And in Benjamin's paper, the question that he asks is, in Indonesia, where farm households are both a household and generating profit potentially from their farming activities, can we observe some separation between the decision-making processes at the farm level and the characteristics of the household? So when we're talking about separation, and when I continue to talk about separation, that is what I'm talking about. And what I want you guys to try and think about is to reach back in your brain into the consumer and producer theory lessons that we got right at the beginning of microeconomics. And at the plot level, if the farmers are rational and optimizing, they are trying to optimize output or profit at each plot, conditional on plot level characteristics. Now, this should be in theory, if markets are complete and they can obtain inputs at whatever rate that they want, there's labor available, they have full insurance and access to credit and working capital. If all those conditions are met, then farmers will be making choices for their plots, for their farms, based exclusively on their farm or land characteristics. And those should have nothing to do with household characteristics, such as the wealth of the household, how many people that are living in the household, how many cows the household has, the average BMI of household members. Any household characteristics should be separable from the production function or the profit function. Okay, so I'm going to come back to that again, hopefully, but like this should be clear in your mind, because when we get to the estimation, what you're going to see is I'm going to have a bunch of control variables that are plot level control variables, and those we know should be significant, and we're interested in that too, and we want those to make sense. But then once we get to the exclusion restriction variables, and I put exclusion restriction sort of in air quotes, the exclusion restrictions are all of the household level variables. Now, why do we care at all if production and consumption are non-separable? Okay, if production and consumption are non-separable, that means that household characteristics are entering the production function for the farm. And what that means really is that we cannot estimate those separately. And that's really important. This is why I say it relates to the Deaton literature, because in the Deaton sense, in development economics, we have to analyze the household like in its complete sense, because there's a set of decisions being made at the household level that are quite complex in terms of labor allocation in the market, labor allocation on the farm, etc. Whether to run a household non-farm business, which many households do in this data set. Okay, so hopefully that makes some sense, and I'm going to come to your questions about the separation principle in just a moment. Okay, so this is also the Benjamin paper draws from another paper by David Card, a very famous labor economist who you may know from the Card and Kruger 1991 paper, etc. Who actually grew up on a farm in Canada. He's a Canadian labor economist, but also knows a lot about agriculture. And this is based on the principle that we can separate the optimization problem of the farm from the characteristics of the household. Okay, so now that we have sort of understanding about what we're talking about when I say the phrase with the word separation, what are the potential sources that could cause separation? And the literature talks about several. So I think I have a list here. One second. Yeah, I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, so let me talk for a second. Now that I talked about separation, let me talk about, in my paper, I'm going to focus on separation of the labor allocation decision and also the use of fertilizer, which is considered an important investment good. And fertilizer or manure, like I don't want you to think that it's some like high quality, like classy fertilizer, but like manure, like shit from cows, and other livestock is being used to fertilize the fields. And that's an important actual investment, because the marginal benefits of those fertilizers can extend beyond a single season. So applying fertilizer is a big deal if you can get access to that. Okay, so I analyzed both of those. I didn't get the fertilizer part into the presentation yet today, so we're just going to do the labor today, but it's in the paper if you're interested. Okay, so and again, I'm going to provide empirical evidence about the separation. Okay, so another important thing are some basic characteristics of labor markets in developing countries and agricultural labor markets in developing countries. In agricultural labor markets, there's often a kind of two-tiered structure where you have contract permanent laborers who work. Maybe they own their own farm, and then their farm is smaller, so then they go work for most of the time on a larger farm nearby. Those are your permanent contract laborers, perhaps. Then you have a certain second class of itinerant laborers that are moving around. And these are both important to understand, because the main characteristics that define the agricultural labor markets in Tanzania and other developing countries particularly in Tanzania, is that the labor market is quite loose over the preparatory period, which is the period leading up into the harvest period, before the harvest time. And then in the harvest period, the labor market tightens because the demand for labor shoots way up. But labor demand is quite steady and quite spread out over the imagine the 3/4 of the period of the year that's the preparatory period, or however many weeks it is, and then very tight labor markets in the harvest season. So the important aspect is of this to remember, and I'm going to come back to this in the findings part, is that we find that Tanzanian, that I reject separation. There is no separation, but except in the case of hired harvest labor. So what happens is that the households are able to optimize, except in they're optimizing on the plot characteristics only in the case of the harvest season, and then in the rest of the time, they're basically having to rely on family labor. But I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So here's a picture, because there's a lot of words on my slides and you need a break from looking at words. So here's a picture of what agriculture is like in East Africa. And yes, it is a lot of women doing, I'm going to come to some of the descriptive statistics in a moment. It is a lot of women doing agriculture in East Africa. And in this data set, we do have some polygamy. There's a lot of analysis. This is an interesting like kind of sub-story. There's a polygamy in Tanzania and in other parts of Africa, and some of the socioeconomic literature in development does analyze the effects of polygamy on farming and the efficiency of polygamous plots versus husband and wife plots and things like that. Okay, so we have three potential sources of non-separation. So meaning that what would cause it if we are seeing that the characteristics of the household are not separable from the characteristics of the farm or the plot, what would be the sources potentially of those things? One of the things that could be causing that would be that the farm cannot hire labor to the point at which it demands labor, or it may not be able to hire labor at the quality that it demands up until the point which it demands it. So that's one thing. Another thing could be labor rationing, as in there are only so many members of the household, and these members of the household have to stretch their time across a certain number of plots. And because there's so few, and there's also this potential binding constraint, interacting with this binding constraint to off-farm employment, you could have labor rationing. The last thing is, and most important for this paper actually, potentially, is the differences in return to off-farm and on-farm labor. So a lot of the literature assumes that the wage is the same for hiring in an agricultural worker to your farm and working out to an agricultural worker. But actually, because of informational asymmetries, it seems like this, and contract theory, I know this is just like throwing some big phrases out there, but because of informational asymmetries, actually, it seems like hiring quality labor is quite difficult, and that these wages are not clearly the same for workers within the household that are being hired in to work on the household farms, and when the household workers go and work off the farms. And actually, I have a short empirical test about that. It's in the paper already. I compared those two wages, and I find them to be equal for that test, with respect to that test. Okay, so here's some general, let me just pause here and ask if anybody has any questions about separation or the separation hypothesis. And let me open the chat here. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So So just answering a question from Kevin Duncan. So yeah, that's correct, and that's why I'm trying to avoid using the term completeness, because I think it's confusing when I mix the two up. But indeed, when we're talking about a binding constraint to hiring labor in, that's what we're talking about. That their markets are incomplete insofar as you're living in a rural village, you would like to hire high skill manual laborers, not white collar laborers, to farm your farm. And you can only find one, or there's only two per village, where the demand in the village is 10, something like that. So, and then from Thomas Flanagan, what frictions could potentially prevent market from being incomplete here? So I have an answer to this, and I'm going to come to this in the empirical section, but I'll just answer it directly right now. So in the market for being incomplete, population density seems to play a role. So I find in the end, and I'm going to come to the results obviously in the empirical section is next, but I find that in areas that are more population dense, more hired labor and less family labor is used. So I think that we can really think about our rural story here, and distance and density, more than distance, maybe density, being very important. and this is kind of, I'm tipping my hand. I'm very into agricultural geography, so I mean economic geography. So, you know, I always try and think of these angles if I can. And then Kevin asked, there are neoclassical models of household production that generate cases where it isn't worthwhile to hire market-based wage labor. Yes, and I would say, you know, you should keep an eye out, Kevin and everyone else, for my forthcoming paper on Tanzanian female farmers. Tanzanian women farmers wouldn't really want to hire, even though they would have a high marginal product of hiring in labor, they wouldn't want to hire in said labor because we have evidence that they're receiving a statistically lower price of their outputs. So in that case, in those agricultural households, women wouldn't want to hire in labor because that would raise the cost of their output, producing their output, and their output is only going to sell for 15% or 50% of the male output price. So I would say that in that case, you might be able to distinguish that women-headed households and women farmers would be the kind of, even though they would benefit from having access, the most from having access to that kind of labor, are the ones who are least likely to hire that kind of labor and also have constraints on working capital, which is very, very important in a lot of cases. Okay, I'm gonna go back to just the presentation for the moment, and I'll come back to questions anymore that pop up. So this is just giving you a sense of the data. I don't have a slide describing the data set yet, but these data are coming. I did not go to Tanzania to collect the data, unfortunately. I have not yet been to Tanzania. I have collected my own primary data from Tanzania using a text message-based survey that was a panel survey design. It was kind of fun and interesting. I think you would need a much larger sample size. Those data are very noisy, but still interesting nonetheless. You have an interesting cost-benefit analysis of those data. This data comes from the World Bank and the Tanzanian Statistical Authority. There are 4 waves of this panel. It started in 2008 and it ended in 2015 with those 4 waves, which were fairly evenly spaced out across the panel. And each wave contains about 2,000 some households, and these households are measured across the waves of the panel set and tracked. Even split off households are tracked. So I believe there were I forget how many villages. We'll see in a minute when we get to the slides. There are, when I run the regressions with village fixed effects, but there are, you know, a very large sample of households. Tanzania is quite heterogeneous in terms of region. So those specifications, when I come to the village fixed effect and the household fixed effects, are going to be very important because you're wiping out a lot of characteristics in those cases that could be varying at the village level or at the household level. Okay, so here taking a look at the regular households, we see that the number of adult men is about 1. That's across all the income spectrum. And the number of women is 2. So I think this is where I would say that the polygamy story is coming into play. I think that it looks like about 1 in 5 men has a second wife to me. And I wonder whether, you know, that's something that I should dive into more. I probably shouldn't be wondering aloud about that, but it's okay. And then we see that very few households have senior members. So for this slide, the important thing is this, when we come to the empirical side, this is going to be the variable that's the most important, where we reject separation. And I know that I'm tipping the story, but you know, it turns out that labor stock is the most important variable determining preparatory labor in the preparatory season. Okay, so we see that there's a small percentage of households that are headed by females, and we see a small but noticeable gap between years of education between adult males and adult females. Okay. This is a brief rundown, a little bit of the assets that households own or hold in Tanzania. And I did some calculations long ago on the return per acre, and here you have them. So you see like this huge jump between the poor, the middle, and then the non-poor. So like in the richest third of households are able to extract a lot more. And it would be interesting. I should check labor use, you know, by I don't know if I have that on the next slide. I don't have it by, I have labor use per households, but I don't have it by poor, middle, and non-poor. So I should probably, it'll probably be interesting to see. And then owning livestock is a very important source of it's basically livestock in East Africa and in a lot of Africa is considered an investment good or the most liquid investment good. And that is because cows and goats can be liquidated very easily and they're pretty easy to move around because they move themselves. So I put this here, and in my future paper about gender in Tanzania, gender-based discrimination, price discrimination against women-headed households. This is more important, and the livestock sales are a significant source of disparity for women-headed households. So this is just some descriptive statistics to give you a sense of what the households are like in Tanzania. Okay. Then here we see, coming to the meat a little bit of the descriptive statistics, this is the labor use per plot. And then I have it also per acre, but because the average plot size is about an acre, like this doesn't make much difference. And we see that, you know, adult preparatory days are the highest. The preparatory season is about 3 times longer than the harvest season. So kind of makes, if you just do a little bit of math there, you see like that, you know, per period, you know, it would be a little bit smoother, that the adult prep days are kind of, they look bunched up because I've aggregated 3 types of labor that are not harvest labor. Then, you know, the harvest days we see on average, and we see that I would direct your attention to the 4th and the 8th line, which shows the preparatory labor days. And this is super low. Most farms are not hiring in labor to work on their farms. Okay, so recall that I was talking about the potential sources of separation. And one of the potential sources of separation that I mentioned was a differential return to on-farm and off-farm labor. Okay, we actually have a way to test that. This is based on several papers, one by Prana Barden and another by George Frisvold. And in Frisvold's paper, he's checking for the effects of observability on labor output. And so he creates this ratio, and this ratio is the ratio of family labor to total labor. So, and what I'm estimating it here is a production function, which the output variable is output per plot, or per hectare. I believe it's per hectare. And the size of, oh yeah, because A is the size of the plot. So it is output period. And then we can see the change in size, how that affects the output. Then L is labor, and the ratio again is the ratio of the family labor to the total labor. So if we see a sign on the ratio on the change in the ratio, that would indicate that we see a quality differential in the 2 types of labor. And L is the total labor that's being contributed by the 2. So it's family labor plus hired labor. So it's what we call total effective labor. And this specification has been adapted to like basically match exactly, you know, those previous papers. And so here's the kind of intuition about that. And this would be the labor services function, the effective labor services function, number 2. Then we take the log form of the labor services function, and we're given this. And we can have a coefficient on the F plus H, a beta, and the gamma is the coefficient of interest. I do 2 tests of labor quality differential, 3 tests of labor quality differential. I'm showing you just this one because I think this one is the most intuitive. And it also controls for heterogeneous household fixed effects. So, and I also am able to, in the case of the Tanzanian data, because there's pre-harvest disaggregated data and harvest period data, there are 2 ratios. So one is the ratio of family to total labor in the pre-harvest period, and the second is the ratio of family to total labor in the harvest period. Okay, so I think the next slide, yeah. Here's the results of those, okay? So this is the Bardhan-Frisvold test, which includes in columns 3 and 4, village level fixed effects with 133 villages with multiple observations on farm, and in column 4 143 villages, and the variables of interest are well, it's the signs match up for everything. It's great that for the most part that output is increasing in the amount of labor. In general, it's pretty convincingly with the harvest labor. But then looking at ratio 1 and 2, we see not complete pattern of rejection. in the first two, and that's possibly because this ratio does not vary substantially at the household level or at the village level. We see identification in the pooled OLS model, where we would reject equality of labor between household and hired labor in the harvest period. So in the pooled OLS model, which does include wave and soil control variables, but no other error term structure, we can reject that equality. Then in the household fixed effects, we still see a rejection with the tree crops variable. So these are separated into perennial crops and tree crops. Tree crops are farmed and they're a bit different. So like cocoa, coffee's a bush, cocoa, mango, what are the others? Cocoa, mango, sorry, I don't have them right in front of me. Coconut, etc. Banana is kind of like a tree, but not a tree. Orange, and apple. Okay, so the tree crops are estimated separately in this case, and basically I took this last column is perhaps the most restrictive specification, because this is including household fixed effects. We have 1,965 households in this estimate and 2,235 with the perennial crops. And we do not reject in the case of the harvest period. In the case of the preparatory period for the tree crops, it seems like an increase in family labor to total labor results in an increase in output. And I would say, and we see that again also a little bit here in column 1, although it's not significant at the standard level, only at the 10% level. And I would say it makes sense that this happens with the tree crops, that family members would take better care of tree crops, which in general are a longer run investment. Tree crops require care over a period of time longer. Perennial crops, it's wham bam, thank you ma'am. You grow the corn, you cut the corn down, you plant again, and it's done. Whereas trees, require, care and pruning and development over time. Okay, so we don't have a super clear pattern of rejections here, but when we take the pattern of rejections all together between this test, the Vidge-Verbergen-Diel-Alekar test, which is in the paper, and the wage differential test, it seems to indicate that we could have a source of potential non-separation here in a differential of quality. And that was, of course, just wanted to direct your attention back to that. And there's another test that I did, which was called the Diel-Alekar, and I call the Diel-Alekar and Vidge-Verberg test, based on a paper by those authors, which is cited here in the presentation, which I'll make available for everybody at the end. And in this paper, they fit a nonlinear labor services, nonlinear least squares functional form of the labor services function. They presume a very specific functional form of the labor services function, and then run some tests to see if that matches with the data that they have from India and Indonesia, I believe, were the countries where they had data in that paper. Is a little strange. But they do not use any fixed effects, and so I think that the fixed effect specification for me of the Bardan-Frisvold test, even though it doesn't yield the most beautiful result, is the most robust and the most convincing. Okay, now we're at the final part where I'm gonna show the estimates of the separation tests, okay? And what these are at the end of the day are labor demand reduced form estimations. The left-hand side variable, the outcome variable, is going to be labor demand at the plot level. And we have two sets of regressions that I'm gonna show you. First is family labor, and then second is hired labor. And the first three columns, so we see the first set of variables there. At the n variables will be the variables that are the plot control variables. The x variables are the variables that will be household variables. So if we can reject sigma greater than 0, then we reject the separation principle. And we have tests for both preparatory and harvest, and hired and family. So we've got kind of some levels going on here. Let me just pause and see if there's any questions in the chat for a sec. Okay, so I'm coming to Kevin's question, 1:28 p.m. Do you know anything about the share of crops used in home consumption versus sold on the market? Do households that expect to send a large share of their crops to the market hire more non-familial labor, ceteris paribus? The quality differential only exists if there are complete markets, right? For the BF test. Okay, I'm gonna go one by one. Yes, I know about their home consumption versus sold on the market. That's a good question. I will look into that. I would feel pretty confident in telling you yes, that most households that are hiring, that send a large share of their crops, this is highly correlated with hiring labor. And I don't know how to tease out the causality on that. And it's not the question that I want to answer right now. The quality differential only exists if there are complete markets, right? Okay, some other friction. I don't want to say that other frictions couldn't imply non-substitutability of different labor types. However, if there were a personal preference within the household for a certain amount of labor provided, if that were fixed in time, that would be wiped out by, obviously, by the household fixed effects. So if that were changing in time, it would not be wiped out by the household fixed effects. But I think one can imagine a story where a teenager gets a bit older, he starts to feel a little more responsible. Maybe he wants to help out more with the household farm. So maybe his tastes change, and that wouldn't be controlled. That's correct. So it's not perfect. Do families rely on any financing for investment? If so, what type? Right. There's a potential story here about your family members being easier to vet. However, I think this is a two-way street, because I think that there's also I think that there is an equally salient teenage rebellion story here. If you're a teenager, why would you feel motivated to work on the farm except by social pressure? So there's very little access to credit here. There's some penetration of microfinance, but very little. We all, I think, are not red-pilled on microfinance anymore. But I did run tests for separability about credit decision. You can do it for insurance markets and for credit markets also for separation, completeness. But really nobody's getting formal credit in Tanzania, so it didn't really make for a very interesting analysis. But I think I have that analysis around somewhere. Maybe I'll put it in an appendix if I get this question again. Then who's sorting into the wage labor in the local markets? I don't know. That seems like a separate question. That seems like a separate question, Kevin. But I do have BMI as a measure, so I did use that as a control, like managerial BMI. So I don't know. I'm not ignoring it. Yeah, I'm gonna put the slides up after. Okay. All right. So here we come back to the regressions. That's what you all want to see. That's what we all want to see, right? Here's the regression results. The error term has this structure where I have, basically this is borrowed from the Lefave and Thomas econometrical paper. So the Lefave and Thomas paper is the update to the Benjamin paper, the panel data version. And then I'm hoping so I would sort of position my paper as being like the African panel data version of the Asian panel data test. And the error term structure here is given that we have a village time fixed effect. So that would wipe out any shocks to input prices or output prices at the village level. That's NVT. And then if you have this, you have to include the levels terms in the error as well. It's a good lesson. Okay, so first I'm going to do family, and then I'm going to do hired, and then I'm going to conclude. The first two slides are the plot level the plot level variables. So let's look at those quickly, but then I'm going to go through them quickly so that we can focus on the household level variables and talk more about that, because that's where we see the breakdown of the separation. Okay, we see that, and then I'm going to do hired. So there's going to be 4 and then 4. I know it seems a little bit much. All right. So on the left 3 columns, we have preparatory labor, and on the right 3 columns, we have hired labor. We see that across the board, and for family labor, an increase in the size of the plot is increasing the amount of labor applied. So labor markets are functioning in some regard in that the more farm you have, the more labor you get. And we see also that collective plots, which are like the plots that are managed collectively by the household and that presumably produce output in principle for household consumption, those demand more labor as well. And we see an increase in output from irrigated plots, although an increase in labor with irrigated plots, although in one case of the within household variation, we see a decrease in labor in column 6. Okay. Again, these are the other plot level control variables. These are the variables that we are expecting to influence plot level decision making. And except for maybe the last, so plot estimated value, I would argue is, I do have soil control variables in addition to the plot's estimated value, but I feel that plot estimated value also is a proxy for the quality of the plot, and that the farmers have a pretty good sense of the value of their plots as well. Okay, now we're into the variables that are separable. Okay, the first 5 variables here, these are the managerial human capital variables. If it's a female manager, and this is a common source of separation, if there are female managers on the plot, that reduces ceteris paribus the amount of labor that the plot gets. So we could just look at this one line and reject separation if we wanted to. And that's actually quite well documented in the literature that all over Africa, that female managed plots get less labor and less inputs. We see that also mixed gender plots seem to get less. So we see a sort of primogeniture bias, if you will, or a man bias. I don't know how to say it. Then an increase in the age of the managers, arguably is increasing. I don't know if you would want to argue that that's an important source of separation. It could be. I guess it is. The manager being the head of the household as well. But most importantly, I think that the strongest thing that's rejecting separation is that the number of adult members in the household is increasing the amount of labor. Basically, the labor supply that exists in your household is the labor supply that matters for your farm, and not much else. And that's basically what I would say. Like, if I had to sum it all up, all of these results in one sentence, like I would say that is the thing that I would look at. Yes, the all-female manager one is very convincing as well. I'm moving quickly because I want to get to the hired labor parts also. Okay, and we see population density, an increase in population density. And I didn't review this, but this data is coming from satellite inferred population estimates, which are constructed from daytime satellite imagery. That data is available for free. It's called Landscan. It's mentioned in the paper. And if anybody has any questions about that, you can ask me after. The population density, an increase in population density results in a decrease in family labor used. So for me, this is really helping flesh out the story. And it shows that population density is a very important source, potentially in Tanzania, of market separation. And we see, again, age of the household head, years of education of the household head, and gender of the household head all being rejected in various specifications. Okay, agricultural wages is included as an important control variable. All right. Now I'm on to the hired labor. Again, the first 2 parts are the plot control variables. So this is the plot level demand for hired labor. So the outcome variable is the log number of days of hired labor that they are applied to that plot. And we see that for the most part, it's increasing in the size of the plot. Labor markets, again, are not totally dysfunctional. Things are kind of looking like we expect them to look. Collective plots, which we know demand more family labor, demand obviously less hired labor. And then rented plots, where the farmer is really trying to turn a profit, are using more hired labor, you're using less hired labor. So that's kind of interesting. And that might imply for me a quality differential, that there is this quality differential between the migrant farm laborers, or in general, the hired in farm laborers are lower quality than the family labor. And we saw that again with the trees in the Bardhan-Frisvold test, I would argue as well. Okay, and we also see it increasing with manure. So that's so decreasing with manure. So we would say maybe that in some ways that hired labor and manure are substitutes, and that could be, we see that more strongly in the preparatory period than in the harvest period, which makes sense, because most of the manure is being applied, in the preparatory period. It doesn't make much sense to apply manure fertilizer at harvest time. Okay, again, these are the plot level control variables. Distance to the household is further away from the household is increasing the amount of labor that your plot gets. That's strange. Don't know what to say about that. Okay. Now we're on to the, hired labor separation. So again, these are household level characteristics that should not, in theory, be determining labor supply to the farm. And again, we see some pattern of rejections across the columns for the all female managers. Now, I just want to walk through the columns with you in case you're confused. So the first and fourth columns are the pooled OLS estimates. The third and sixth columns are basically the ones that you want to look at because those are the strongest specifications, which include the full structure of the error term. And although I didn't put it here, the soil and slope controls and the village wave fixed effects are applied here as well. So when we're looking here, just imagine that stuff's down here as well. So all of those full strongest strength controls are in columns 3 and 6. And we're still seeing some patterns of rejection. But in particular, okay, like I said, the most important one is the rejection of the number of adult household members having a negative influence on the amount of hired labor demanded in both the harvest and the preparatory labor period. Okay. We see some signs of child labor as well. It's not a center focus of my paper. It's important, but it's not a central focus of the paper. Okay. And again, this is the last table. Then I'm just going to briefly talk about some robustness checks. The total value of the household assets. So the wealth of the household seems to matter a lot in terms of how much labor you're able to leverage. And that could be, the channel for that could be working capital constraints, that more wealthy households are having easier access to working capital for their businesses, which they can use to hire labor. That would be a very standard story in developing countries. And also animal units is increasing the amount of hired labor used, and that could suggest that the hired labor is specializing. Well, we don't see that actually in the panel data specification. So we don't see an increase in the number of animals at the household level, increasing the amount of hired labor at the household level, but we do see that at the village level. At the pooled estimates in columns 2 and 5. And that could be that the hired labor specializes in working with with oxen to plow the fields, to till the farm, or working with animals in general. That's the case in West Africa, and in the sociological agricultural literature. That's what's discussed. Okay, so I'm going to talk just briefly. Let me just see if there's any questions now, just quickly, since I came to the end of that section. Yeah, okay. There's a fair comment. All right. Population density is the opposite direction that you would have expected. For me, increase in population density means more liquid bodies for the presence of a labor market. I don't know. For me, I don't know. What does it mean to you? Yes, that's a good point Kevin raises. If there are 1 or 2 covariates you care about, you could suppress all results beside those for those covariates in the table. Alternatively, I can just do an F test of all of the exclusion restrictions, right? Okay, yeah, I'm getting there to the policy implications. Okay. All right, so what are some principal concerns with these estimations? First, there's a strong possibility of interview recall bias. There's a possibility of interview recall bias, meaning that if the interviews took place long before or long after or somewhat after the agricultural season, that farmers may not remember exactly what inputs they use or other decisions or the exact value of outputs. Another potential source of bias, which is discussed and could apply in this context, is what's deemed endogenous labor supply. In my opinion, that's more of an issue. I'm going to talk about that in a second. I have a robustness check for that, but that's more of an issue for me in West Africa, where the distance between villages is much smaller. And so you can have workers moving in a migrant sense from one village to another as the agricultural season changes, and endogenous labor supply is much more of an issue. But in Tanzania, it's very spread out. It's a very large geographic country. And I think that you don't really, it would be very difficult, in my opinion, to have family members, unless you drive a car or fly around, for family members to be moving endogenously to match with the agricultural seasons. Okay. Then lastly, there could be crop-specific rejections, but that not all markets are that you have separation in some markets for some crops, but not for others. In case there's crop-specific separation. So the last robustness check, which is in the paper, is single crop regression. So I don't have these in this presentation, but I'm just going to run down the results from the top of my head, which are in the paper and discussed. There are interview month dummies. So I basically performed exactly the same specification, including an indicator dummy for the month that the interview was performed. The interview month dummies were highly significant. It didn't change the results substantially. The number of household members is still a principal determinant of the amount of labor at the plot level. Then I excluded endogenous members of the endogenous changes in the household. Because I have household rosters, I know which members just joined the household within the last year. I tried excluding all of those members and all the labor contribution from those members, and I found that it didn't change the results substantially. Then lastly, I did single crop regressions. I don't have the papers behind me. I don't have it right in front of me, and I don't remember the exact pattern of rejections across all of the single crops, but I do run through all of the crops for which I had enough sample size to do some analysis. And I'm happy to talk about all that in case anybody's really interested in more. Okay, so what are the conclusions? So hired labor at harvest time can be, from the Diel-Alekar and Bijverberg test, which was not pictured here, hired labor is more productive than family labor, except with respect to tree crops. And according to according to the results of the differences in labor productivity and the testing that I did with that, the DV test, the BF test, and the wage differential test, which are all three in the paper, and only one of which I discussed in this presentation. The gap in hired productivity and in productivity between family and hired labor closes at the harvest season, which is consistent with economic theory about observability of labor contracts and labor contracts for the preparatory period being hard to observe. The product of labor is much harder to observe in the preparatory period of the agricultural season than in the harvest period, because in the harvest period, I just see how much you harvested. Then the tests using household fixed effects reject the separation of the production and consumption of production decisions from consumption characteristics or household characteristics, except in the case of the hired harvest labor. And these tests are all robust. This is what I did. I actually didn't mention this earlier, but should have highlighted. These tests are robust to heterogeneous household preferences, because I actually did mention in response to one of Kevin's questions, but if the household has different preferences for labor, that could affect whether they hire in labor. So if the household loves farming, if it's a farm-loving household, maybe, but that should be controlled for with household fixed effects. And in more population dense parts of Tanzania, more hired labor and less family labor is used. And I think that the policy implications are that it could be good to have some, this is a bit abstracting from this context, but from the data itself, from the analysis itself, it could be good to have some system where agricultural labor movement was facilitated in this large region. So like maybe some busing system or investments in public infrastructure to move laborers from village to village, something like that. Second, I think this is kind of funny, but I think it's true. I think if you want to offer an explicit contract to your family members and you think that might improve their productivity, I think that's a potential policy implication here. Family economics. Okay, so that's basically all I've got. I'm going to check any more questions. The one last question from Kevin: how many endogenous changes in household membership were from new children? This is a fair question, but because of the life of the survey was only 5 years, no child was born at the beginning of the survey that was like working substantially on the farm by the end of the survey. So I wasn't concerned about that. All right, guys, thanks. I'm happy to take any questions, and I'm going to upload the slides, further questions in DM or whatever, and I'm going to upload the slides right after this.